In the cold desert night, Ethan Cole rode along the broken fence line with only the wind for company when he saw a pale-shaped collapse beside a dying mesquite tree, and his breath caught, because the woman was unlike anyone he had ever seen, her skin almost glowing under the moon, her body shaking with fear and blood seeping through torn cloth. And as he knelt beside her, she tried to speak, but only a desperate whisper escaped before her eyes rolled back, and he felt a sharp dread climb his spine, because the silence around them was suddenly too deep, too perfect, like hunters holding their breath in the dark. And even though he knew helping her could destroy everything he owned, something inside him refused to walk away. So he lifted her into his arms, unaware that this single choice would pull him toward danger, loss, and a truth he was never prepared to face. Ethan Cole lived on the edge of Apache territory, where the desert stretched wide and silent, yet every night carried a new sign of danger, because cattle vanished without a sound and strange footprints appeared near the water troughs, prints too light to belong to any man he knew, and the townspeople whispered that someone or something was moving through their land unseen, and Ethan felt the weight of that fear settle over him like dust on his coat. But he kept to his routine, rising before sunrise, working the fences, tending the horses, eating alone, listening to the desert breathe around him. And even though he pretended the trouble was far away, he could feel a shift in the air, as if the land itself was waiting, holding its breath, preparing to break open. And deep inside, he sensed that his quiet life was about to change in a way he could neither stop nor understand. Ethan Cole felt that uneasy shift tighten around his chest as the desert twilight deepened into a darker shade, and the wind carried a strange tremor that made the horses restless. But he pushed through his evening chores with steady hands until a sharp metallic clang echoed from the far edge of his land and drew him toward the broken fence line with a growing sense of urgency that refused to settle. And as he moved closer, the air thinned as though the night itself braced for something he could not yet see. Then a faint cry drifted through the silence, a sound so fragile and frightened that it sliced through his nerves and pulled him into a fast stride toward the source without a second thought. And when he reached the scattered brush near a leaning mesquite tree, he stopped as his breath hitched, because a woman lay collapsed against the roots, her skin pale as moonlit ash, her limbs trembling from cold and exhaustion. And before he could question anything, she lifted her gaze toward him with eyes full of terror, as if expecting something far worse than death to find her first. And he stepped forward, slowly speaking soft words meant to calm her, but she flinched as though even kindness might break her further. Yet she did not pull away when he knelt beside her, and he noticed the deep gash along her side, the dried blood on her hands, the bruises branding her shoulders, and the torn clothing marked with symbols he did not recognize, but instinct told him they carried meaning, weight, and danger he had no way to measure. Still, the fear in her face mattered more than every unanswered question racing through his mind. So he reached for her gently and felt her body go limp as she struggled to whisper something, lost between breath and pain, until her voice faded into the cold wind. And that moment forced him to look over his shoulder, because the desert had gone too quiet again, as if hidden eyes watched every movement he made. And he felt that same sharp dread crawl up his spine, warning him that staying out here any longer would cost them both more than they could bear. Therefore he lifted her carefully in his arms, surprised by how light she was, almost weightless, like someone who had been running longer than her strength allowed. Then he carried her toward his horse with a steady determination that pushed aside his fears, because leaving her alone, even for a second, felt unforgivable. And once he settled her across the saddle, he climbed up behind her, holding her securely while urging the horse into a swift but silent ride back toward the ranch. though every shadow along the path seemed to shift as if following them, and every rustle in the brush sounded like a warning that reached the center of his chest, making his heart beat faster with each passing second. Still he refused to slow down even when the path grew rough and the night grew colder, because the woman's faint breath against his sleeve reminded him she was fighting for life with whatever strength remained inside her. And when the first lantern light from his porch came into view, he felt a brief flicker of relief, yet it vanished the moment he sensed movement behind him. Subtle disturbance in the darkness that made him tighten his grip around her protectively as he guided the horse through the gate and straight toward the stable, where he dismounted quickly without letting her fall. Then he carried her inside the house, placing her on the nearest couch, as the dim glow revealed more injuries hidden beneath the torn cloth, and the sight struck him with a surge of anger toward whoever had done this, though he forced himself to stay calm while fetching water, bandages, and whatever supplies he had left from earlier wounds earned during ranch work. And as he cleaned the gash along her side, she stirred slightly, but her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow like someone caught between waking and fading. And he spoke to her in a quiet, steady tone, telling her she was safe now, even though he was not certain that safety truly existed tonight, because the oppressive silence outside seemed to gather around the windows like an unseen presence, waiting for its moment to strike. Yet despite that heavy fear, he kept working until the bleeding stopped and her trembling eased. And as he finally sat back, wiping sweat from his brow, he realized the storm he had sensed earlier was no longer distant, because whatever or whoever hunted her was now only one step behind them, and the night around his ranch felt ready to break open at any moment. Ethan Cole stayed beside the wounded woman as the lantern flickered against the wooden walls and cast long trembling shadows that made the small room feel tighter with every passing second. And when she finally opened her eyes, her gaze drifted across the unfamiliar space before settling on him with confusion mixed with deep fear, as if she expected danger to burst through the door at any moment. Yet she made no attempt to move, because weakness held her still, and her breathing trembled like someone clinging to the last strands of strength. And he spoke softly, telling her she was safe here, while offering a cup of water that she struggled to lift until he steadied her hand and helped her drink. And once she gathered enough breath, she whispered her name, barely audible, as though even that simple truth carried weight heavier than her body could withstand. And he nodded, encouraging her gently to rest, but she shook her head, refusing sleep, because she feared closing her eyes would let something dark catch up to her. So he pulled a chair closer, giving her space, yet staying near enough to reassure her that she was not alone in this harsh night. And as she tried to sit upright, he noticed the way her fingers trembled, not only from exhaustion, but from memories she was clearly fighting to hide. And when he asked if someone was after her, she hesitated, pressing her palm against the wound on her side as though pain might steady her thoughts. Then she admitted in a strained whisper that she had fled from people who wished to claim her life for reasons she could not explain. Yet reasons tied to marks burned into the cloth she wore, marks that held a meaning too dangerous to speak aloud in the open air of the desert. And while she spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of fear and sorrow that had traveled with her under the moon, making Ethan feel a surge of protective anger, unlike anything he had felt before, because whoever wanted to harm her had left her in a state no human deserved to endure. Yet he kept his tone calm, telling her she could share whatever she wished without any pressure, and that she would not be forced to reveal more than she could bear. And after a long silence, she reached for the blanket he had placed over her, then gripped its edge tightly, as if grounding herself before telling him that betrayal from her own people had driven her into the wilderness, betrayal that stemmed from her rare appearance and the superstition surrounding it. And though she offered no names, she hinted that leaders within her tribe had turned on her After a shift in power threatened their control, which forced her to escape through the night with no food, no weapon, and no hope, except the faint belief that someone beyond her world might help her survive until sunrise. And Ethan listened closely, watching the rise and fall of her breath, noticing the fragile thread that connected her words to the desperation in her eyes, and he realized that whatever conflict she carried was far larger than one injured woman and one quiet rancher in the middle of the desert, because the footsteps he thought he heard earlier were not illusions but signs that danger still followed her trail and might reach his land before long. Yet instead of letting that fear control him, he spoke with quiet certainty, telling her she would not face this alone, that he would protect her as long as she remained under his roof. And those words seemed to soften something inside her, because her shoulders loosened slightly, though her expression still carried the tension of someone expecting the world to collapse around them. And she whispered that helping her could cost him everything he owned, but he answered with steady resolve, saying he understood the risks and accepted it without regret, for leaving her to suffer was something he could never allow. And as the night deepened and the desert wind pushed softly against the windows, she finally leaned back against the pillow, her eyes drifting toward the dim lantern, as though its small glow offered comfort in a world that had treated her with cruelty. And Ethan watched over her, realizing that fragile peace in the room was only borrowed time, because every second that passed brought them closer to whatever force hunted her. Yet he remained unwavering, determined to face whatever approached. When the next shadow crossed the edge of his land, dawn crept slowly across the horizon as Ethan Cole stepped to the window, scanning the pale desert for any sign of movement, while the wounded woman rested behind him with her eyes half closed, fighting sleep even as exhaustion pulled her deeper. And just as the first streak of sunlight touched the far ridge, he caught sight of drifting dust rising in a tight, controlled pattern that no morning wind could create, a sign that riders were approaching with purpose and not by chance, making his pulse tighten as he moved quietly to the door and checked the rifle leaning against the wall. Though he hoped he would not need it, yet the steady rhythm of hooves grew louder until the ground trembled under their weight, and he heard the woman whisper his name in a fragile voice shaking with dread as she forced herself upright, gripping the couch for balance. And he turned toward her, seeing the terror returning to her eyes, as though the sunrise itself had carried the danger she feared. Then, before he could speak, the riders burst into view, forming a hard semicircle around the ranch with practiced precision as dust settled around their horses' legs, revealing a group of Apache warriors with stern faces marked by symbols that reflected rank and authority. And at their center sat a woman with fierce posture and sharp eyes that held a storm of emotion boiling beneath her calm exterior, a presence so commanding that even the restless horses fell silent in her shadow. And Ethan understood instantly that she was someone of immense importance, someone who could change the fate of anyone she confronted. Yet he stepped onto the porch with steady breath, refusing to show hesitation, as the woman raised her hand, signaling the warriors to hold position while she dismounted with slow, deliberate grace. Then she walked forward until only a few steps separated them, and studied his face with a gaze that felt like a blade sliding through his thoughts. And before he could greet her, she spoke in a tone laced with accusation and pain, declaring that he had interfered with matters that belonged only to her people, and that by sheltering the woman inside, he had crossed a boundary no outsider should dare approach. And Ethan felt the weight of her words press against him, yet he answered calmly that the woman had been near death, and leaving her would have meant abandoning her to suffering no human deserved. But the leader's expression hardened as if kindness carried no meaning in her world. Then she announced in a cold, unwavering voice that his entire ranch would now be claimed by her tribe as compensation for the disturbance he had created. a declaration so sudden and severe that it struck Ethan like a blow to the chest, though he kept his stance firm. And behind him the wounded woman stepped into the doorway despite her weakness, drawing every eye toward her as she called out to the leader with a trembling voice that carried both fear and longing. And the fierce woman turned sharply, revealing a flicker of raw emotion in her steady posture as she whispered her daughter's name in disbelief, because this leader was not merely a figure of power, but the mother who had been searching through the desert for the pale, wounded girl now standing behind Ethan. And for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop as mother and daughter faced each other with a heavy silence that held years of unspoken pain. Yet the moment shattered quickly when the mother's anger surged again as she pointed at Ethan, accusing him of stealing her daughter in the dead of night for reasons she refused to trust, insisting that a rare daughter was a prize outsiders might desire for their own gain. And the wounded woman shook her head, desperately telling her mother that he had saved her life when death was only moments away. But emotion clouded the mother's judgment as she stepped forward, her voice cracking with grief, claiming she had lost warriors searching for her daughter through the desert darkness, and she would not allow any outsider to stand between them now. And Ethan held his ground, though every part of him sensed the danger building like a storm ready to break. Yet he spoke with quiet strength, asking her to listen to her daughter before making a decision that could destroy an innocent man's home. And the mother hesitated, briefly torn between fierce loyalty to her tribe and the fragile truth trembling in her daughter's voice as the rising sun cast long shadows around them, turning the desert into a stage where one wrong word could ignite a conflict none of them were prepared to face. The mother's brief hesitation hung in the warming air as the wounded woman stepped further into the sunlight, and her fragile posture revealed how close she was to collapsing, yet her eyes held a desperate courage that forced every warrior to look at her with a mixture of shock and restraint. And Ethan Cole watched her fight for breath before she spoke again, her voice trembling but carrying truth that refused to be silenced as she told her mother that the danger swallowing their tribe was not born from outsiders, but from the corrupted leader who had twisted sacred beliefs into weapons and mocked her as a symbol to control. And the mother's expression tightened painfully as though each word cut into her chest, because she had suspected betrayal but never imagined it carried such depth. Yet pride and responsibility forced her to maintain authority before her warriors as she demanded details that her daughter struggled to give, because every memory of pursuit echoed with torment. Still she lifted her hand, pressing it against her wound as if the pain could steady her, while she revealed that the power-hungry leader had declared her existence a sign of spiritual possession, claiming that her rare appearance threatened the tribe's balance and must be bound to him to preserve order. And she confessed that defying him meant death, not only for her, but for anyone who dared to stand beside her, which explained the relentless riders who had hunted her across the desert until she collapsed under that lonely tree. And the mother's fierce mask cracked for a heartbeat as sorrow washed through her posture, making her look less like a leader and more like a mother who feared she had failed her child. Yet the surrounding warriors stirred uneasily, because this truth challenged the authority they had sworn to obey, forcing the mother to lift her chin and step closer to her daughter with slow, controlled movements as she asked why she had not returned to seek protection instead of running into the unknown. And the daughter whispered that she could not risk leading the corrupt leader's followers back to the village, because his influence had already clouded many minds, leaving her unsure who she could trust. And those few words created a deep silence that settled heavily across the ranch as the warriors exchanged cautious glances, unsure whether they were hearing forbidden truths or desperate lies born from fear. But Ethan stepped forward slightly without aggression and told the mother that her daughter had spoken the same terror, filled Words during the night when she had barely been conscious, which meant these claims were not shaped by panic, but by reality. And though the mother did not turn toward him, he saw her shoulders stiffen with the weight of conflicting loyalties as she wrestled with the possibility that her tribe had been misled by a leader she had once trusted. Then the daughter's knees buckled suddenly, and she collapsed against Ethan's arm, forcing him to catch her gently, while her mother rushed forward with instinct overriding authority as she touched her daughter's face with trembling fingers, whispering her name with a fear she could not hide. And that pure moment stripped away every accusation she had thrown at Ethan earlier, because she saw clearly that he had been guarding the fragile life she nearly lost to the desert. Yet before she could speak, a sudden distant thud echoed across the plain, drawing all eyes toward the horizon, where a second dust plume rose rapidly, revealing another group of riders approaching with fierce speed far more chaotic than the mother's organized formation. And the daughter's face drained of color as she whispered that this was the corrupt leader's hunting party, the very men who had chased her through the night, causing tension to snap like a drawn wire as the mother ordered her warriors into defensive lines, while Ethan pulled the daughter back toward the doorway, shielding her with his body as the pounding hooves grew louder and the air trembled with the promise of violence. And in that breathless moment the mother turned toward Ethan with a hardened resolve that acknowledged the truth she had resisted, and told him that whatever happened next, he must not let her daughter fall into their hands again, because losing her would mean surrendering the tribe to darkness. And Ethan nodded with unwavering determination as the approaching riders thundered closer, turning the quiet sunrise into a battlefield waiting to ignite. The corrupt leader's riders tore across the desert with ruthless speed as dust swallowed the horizon, and Ethan Cole tightened his hold on the wounded woman, guiding her back inside, while the mother and her warriors formed a tense line that braced for impact. And the woman